The keynote speaker today is Dr. Leslie Gewin. Leslie received her medical degree from the University of Alabama at Birmingham, go UAB, and then moved to Johns Hopkins, where she completed her internal medicine training, and then moved back south to Vanderbilt, where she completed a nephrology fellowship and then stayed on faculty. And she's risen in the ranks. Currently, she's assistant professor of medicine at that institution. Leslie performs basically preclinical sorts of work. She has been well funded initially, I think, through a VA Career Development Award, and now has coveted NIH R01 as well as VA Merit Award. So she's very well funded. She's hardworking. She's also interested in clinical activities and is an excellent teacher, as I understand. And so she's a triple threat, if you will. Her research is focused on progression of chronic kidney disease, and in particular, the hallmark of that disease is tubular interstitial fibrosis. And so her interests involve how to prevent that from happening in our patients. So without further ado, Dr. Gewin's talk is entitled My Life in Science, Lessons Learned from the Road Less Traveled. Leslie, thank you for coming this morning.
Thank you. So good morning, and first of all, I want to thank Paul Sanders for the invitation to come and speak with you today. It was only 11 years ago that I was sitting in your seats and presenting my research at this very same forum. And so when I got the opportunity to come and be the keynote speaker, there's some things you get invited to do as when you're in academic medicine that you feel like you need to say yes, but you don't really want to do. And there's some things that you think, wow, this is exciting. I can't wait. And this is definitely in that latter category. So I'm really thrilled to be talking to you today about sort of some things that I've learned from my time in academic medicine. I think one of the things that's so neat about this forum is a lot of times when you're presenting your work early on, you're presenting to a group that includes people who've been in that area for 10, 15, 20 years. And here you're really presenting among your peers. And this is really a unique opportunity. So I hope that it is as positive an experience for you as it was for me. I'll be talking more about my journey in science and less about the actual research that I've done. And kind of alluding to the Robert Frost quote here, as you all know, this road in academic medicine is not always an easy road, but what I hope to convince you of is the fact that it can be a very rewarding road as well, even though it is one that is less traveled. So my background is, as Dr. Sanders mentioned, I'm a clinician, and I have a basic science research lab that I lead. And I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of paths in academic medicine. And so what I have here is sort of a very organized, simple structure of what we think of as the general path to that coveted first tenure track position. So a lot of people start off majoring into science in their undergraduate studies, and then whether you're a PhD or an MD, the paths sort of follow a certain script. You'll go to medical school or graduate school. If you're in the MD route, that involves residency training and then fellowship training, where usually you start to focus really on your research topic. Then there's the clinical instructor, which is sort of like the glorified postdoc. I'll talk a little bit more about that position in a bit. And then finally, your tenure track position. Similarly with graduate school, there's sort of a certain order to things. My path didn't exactly follow this neat route. So back in the days when your family would get a printed newspaper, the Sunday newspaper always had the comic section, and I was a big fan of Family Circus. And so if any of you have seen this, there's the little child Billy and you can see his path sort of traced throughout. His mom asked him to go pick up some firewood, And he goes all around and just sort of has this very winding path, and eventually comes back with maybe 2 twigs for the fire. And there's some times when I felt like my path was more like this than like the very structured and organized path shown on the previous slide. But I think the important thing, and one of the messages I want to convey to you, is that there's not one right way to get to your goal. And sometimes what's more important is the path ahead rather than the path behind. So my start was somewhat dubious for a scientific career. Again, I didn't have the typical start. I was actually a religion major in college. And I've gotten a lot of comments when people look at my CV and say, a religion major. And you can kind of see the, what were you thinking question on their minds. And for me, it was, I was an athlete in college, and I was a rower, and the push-off from the boathouse was at 4:30. And most of the labs went from 1:30 to 4:30. And I found it very difficult to be at 2 places in one time. And I enjoyed religion, had no intention of going to the seminary, but I took some great classes. One was called Preachers, Prophets, and Conmen in American Society. It was the right thing for me at that time. It didn't really prepare me so well for a scientific career, however. So then after I graduated, I decided, I want to take a year off. I'm going to go and work for a nonprofit organization in Chicago and just experience Chicago for a year. Well, my father, after paying for 4 years of Princeton, was kind of confused. Why are you going to work for a nonprofit? But at least this was a little bit more health-oriented, but it was more into public policy and lobbying and grassroots organization. Not that much involved with bench work, which is, of course, what I'm involved with now. So I entered medical school with no background in anatomy, physiology, or biochemistry. I'd like to say I had the dubious distinction of being the first-year medical student with the fewest number of science classes in my background. But I sort of approached it as, well, I'll learn what I need to know in medical school. And then the summer after my first year in medical school, I had the opportunity to do some research and actually went to Duke and worked with a palliative care doctor on health literacy and medication compliance. And it was interesting. It wasn't something that really lit my passion, but and that's still unpublished, and that was in 1999. I don't think that's going to be published. So then, as Dr. Sanders mentioned, I went on to Johns Hopkins to internal medicine residency, and you get a chance to be involved in research in your residency, but for 2 weeks. And as you know, there's not a whole lot that you can really accomplish in 2 weeks. I was very lucky. I worked with a guy named Bernard Jarr. He had me look through some data on kidney and end-stage renal disease and infections, and I kind of got the experience of what that was like. Again, unpublished data. And so I came to Vanderbilt in 2005 for my nephrology fellowship. And as some of you, especially in the clinical route, may know, you always get asked when you're interviewing for fellowships, what do you want to do with the rest of your life? Where do you see yourself in 10 years? I said, I had this vague notion that I might like research based on my 2 weeks in residency and who knows what in med school, in undergrad. But I didn't want to do anything involving pipettes or mice, which is somewhat ironic because that's a lot of what goes on in my lab today. I took care of many patients who were on dialysis and had end-stage renal disease. And that led me to really question what we were doing. How were we caring for these patients? The quality of life for these patients changed dramatically once they went on dialysis. And so I really saw a need. If we could somehow keep them off of dialysis for longer, that would really help these people in a very substantial way. How can we make this care better? And so at age 31, I had just finished my clinical training in nephrology that first year. I entered the basic science lab of Roy Zent to better understand the pathophysiology of renal fibrosis. And I love telling this story because I think it captures sort of where I was at the moment. So for those of you who are PhDs, you know, you've gone through medical school, you've gone through this clinical training, and here it was July, the beginning of my second year of fellowship. I was feeling very confident about my clinical skills, and I was paired with a 19-year-old undergraduate who was going to show me how to use the pipettes in Dr. Zent's lab. So I think you have to have a little bit of humility and an understanding that you're sort of starting at ground zero again when you enter your fellowship, or at least I was, without the history of a PhD. So I think when I think about how did I get from that religion major in undergraduate studies to running a small basic science lab now, sometimes I wonder where did that road lead? How did I get there? And I think one important component of that is mentorship and the people that I met along the way. And I can't I don't think it's possible to overstate the importance of mentorship. And mentorship comes in a lot of different ways. So initially, some of my early mentors were at UAB. Some of you may recognize these faces. On the left there is Bill Dismukes, who was head of the residency program at UAB, and I think he was chief of infectious diseases as well. He also happened to be my next door neighbor, and his son and I threw pine cones at each other when we were in 5th grade. So he was an early mentor to me because I didn't come from a family of doctors. Most of my family was in law. And so I didn't know what it meant, what you had to do to go to medical school, what it meant to be an academic physician. And he was very instrumental in help introducing me to that process. And then just through dumb luck, I was assigned to David Warnock as my mentor when I was a medical student. And Dr. Warnock was the chief of nephrology at UAB at the time. And I think that had a real big impact. He said, hey, you should really come with me in the wards. You should see these patients who have kidney disease and have a better understanding. And I think that exposure definitely was a big influence in my decision to go into nephrology. So this picture, I know we have some folks here from Duke. This is Dave Zoss, who was my chief resident when I was at Hopkins as an intern. And the way it works at Hopkins is that you spend about 4 or 5 months with your chief resident, so you get a real close bond with that person. And Dave is an interesting guy. He, like me, didn't have a PhD, didn't have much background in basic science, but he said, that's okay, it doesn't matter. You can do this. You can go into a lab and you can get the training you need and you can be successful in this. Now, later on, it turns out he did go into a basic science lab in pulmonary. He then left that lab and got his MBA. Is now running a healthcare system. But I think hearing that from someone who was a few steps ahead of me opened the possibility that someone like myself, who was a religion major and had no PhD, could actually have a chance at a career in basic science. And then, and last but certainly not least, this is Roy Zent. And he was the mentor, he was my primary mentor. And it was his lab that I joined as a fellow. And I'm very indebted to him because, here I show up, I don't know up from down in the lab. I really needed a lot of patience, a lot of time to help teach me the skills that I needed to be successful. And he was willing to take a chance on me and said, that's fine. I understand you don't have the experience. I don't care. If you're willing to work hard, I can make you successful. And so, and he still to this day, actually all of these people remain mentors and colleagues. And I think that I'm very lucky for that. So one thing I would say to you in the audience is, don't be shy about seeking out mentors. And your mentor doesn't have to be just your primary mentor. There are a lot of people out here there are a lot of people that want to help you. And if you email someone and say, hey, I'm really interested in what you're doing, I'd love to find out more about that. Would you like to meet me for coffee? Well, most of us love talking about ourselves. So no one is going to say no. People are always going to find time to talk about how you can get to where you want to be. So kind of going back again to my path, I was really struck by the transition from chronic kidney disease to dialysis. When you saw patients in the clinic who had chronic kidney disease, they were happy. As a matter of fact, you had to convince them that they had a problem. They didn't feel any differently. But once they went on dialysis, that changed pretty dramatically. And so I thought, if there's a way we can stop that progression of chronic disease to dialysis, that would be great. And to do this, I felt like we had to really understand well what the pathophysiology is of renal fibrosis. As Dr. Sanders mentioned, that's sort of what I decided to focus on. If I can understand that process better, then maybe I can stop it, or at least slow it down. So I think when I was a resident in one of those sort of bleary-eyed post-call moments, there was a talk about TGF-beta that I went to. And so I came to Vanderbilt with no real clear idea of what I wanted to do, but I had this idea that TGF-beta was important in fibrosis. Most of the attention of TGF-beta at the time was on the fibroblast. And that makes sense. The fibroblast produces a lot of matrix proteins, which constitute fibrosis. And so this reference may be a little too old for some of you in the audience, but with apologies to the 1980s war on drugs, this is kind of a picture of your fibroblast. And this is your fibroblast on TGF-beta. So the fibroblast really undergoes a massive transition to this myofibroblast. It produces a lot of matrix, has increased stress fiber formation. And so when I was entering the lab, the thought was TGF-beta is a major mediator of fibrosis, and it's mainly through the fibroblast. But I was sort of interested in the epithelial cell, the tubule cell, because that's really the target of injury. And I wanted to know, what's the role of epithelial TGF-beta on fibrosis? And I tell people sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. I was very lucky at Vanderbilt because there was a man named Dr. Hal Moses. And Dr. Moses was kind of the godfather of the field of TGF-beta. He's not a nephrologist. He's actually a pathologist. He was what they called sort of the yellow berets in the NIH. He wasn't even going to go into academic medicine. I love this story. And then because of war, he had to get his service commitment and had to go to the NIH, got very involved in research, and he actually taught the pharmaceutical companies how to isolate TGF-beta from platelets. That was really great for me because in return for him teaching them that technique, he got a lifetime of free TGF-beta. So he was a great mentor to have for a number of reasons. And he had made these mice where the TGF-beta type 2 receptor, which you have to have for signaling, was floxed. And all that means is that then you can take it out in specific cell types. So Roy Zent at the time, before I even met Roy, he had a collaboration with Hal. And Roy Zent was more interested in kidney development. He is interested in fibrosis as well, but he was interested in how TGF-beta affected the developing kidney. So he had crossed these mice from Hal Moses with a Cree that was specific for the ureteric bud or the collecting duct. And much to his dismay and my excitement, these mice had no developmental phenotype. They developed just fine, thank you. But it produced mice that had the collecting ducts that were not able to signal TGF-beta. And he gave them to me and said, why don't you look and see how they respond to injury? So I was thrilled. I could take these mice and injure them with the hypothesis that taking out this receptor would actually protect them against injury. So this is a slide that actually may have been in my presentation, I realized 11 years ago. And I found that it was the exact opposite of what I anticipated. So this picture here shows in blue where the receptor was deleted. As you can appreciate, that's the collecting system. And over there on the far right is the mouse without the receptor, and you see more pink stuff. It's this pink acellular stuff that's consistent with matrix. And there was more fibrosis, and this was confirmed with immunoblots. And I promise this is the last immunoblot you'll see, no more. So this was very unexpected. all the literature was talking about how profibrotic TGF-beta was. And here I found that if you take out the receptor, they have more fibrosis. So what do you do when here you are, this clinical fellow who comes into the lab, you've had 2 years of experience, and you find a result that goes against what all the published literature say? And so I assumed that I must be doing something wrong. So initially I had a group of maybe 5 mice, with the receptor, 5 mice. Without the receptor, well, clearly I need more mice. So I did more mice and found the same thing. So I must be doing something wrong. And I assumed that there was a lot of mice, unfortunately, that were sacrificed in an IACUC appropriate way because I was not sure about my data. But after the numbers were getting up into the 20s, I started to think, well, maybe I should actually believe this. Maybe there's something to this. And so I think I want to let you know, sometimes you come into science, especially if you don't have a very long history in bench research, doubting yourself, and it's always good to take a skeptical eye at your work. I think that that's really important. But at some point, you may have to actually believe your data. So then I moved over to the proximal tubule, which was a move I had been wanting to make ever since I joined Roy's lab. I thought the proximal tubule was just a fascinating cell and a lot more interesting in my opinion. And this is because a lot of it, the proximal tubule does a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of solute reabsorption. And as a result of that, it needs to generate a lot of ATP. And so it's chock full of these mitochondria to generate this ATP. But of course, that means it consumes a lot of oxygen. And that makes it vulnerable to acute kidney injury. Also, the proximal tubule is very important in reabsorbing both filtered proteins and glucose, and that can also make an important player in chronic injury. So I basically repeated a similar type study with the collecting system, but with the proximal tubule. And I used this ursolithic acid injury model, which is a toxin-based model. And what you can see on the right side, hopefully you can appreciate from where you're sitting, the tubules are more dilated, there's more epithelial flattening, there's more sort of this proteinaceous cast-like material. And then serious red stains for collagens, and you see more staining there. And there was increased fibrosis as measured by qPCR collagen 1. And then we looked at another injury model because the injury models in basic research, none of them are perfect. You want to make sure that what you see can be applied to another model. So we used the unionephrectomy angiotensin 2 model and actually saw something very similar. So at this point in my career, I'd found this observation in 2 different tubular types in the kidney and several different injury models. I'm not going to go into the mechanism at this point, but that's kind of where I was when I was in that sort of transition from being a fellow to faculty. And I want to spend some time on that period in your career development because I think it's really an important part. I was, I think, a clinical instructor for about 4 years, and we would kind of joke and call it the clinical instructor purgatory, which isn't totally fair because there's a lot of negative connotations with purgatory, right? And in the next slide, I'll explain why this point was so important in my career and where you can make some mistakes or where you can really set yourself up well to be successful depending on how you spend this time. I did think it was kind of a funny title because I would tell my parents and friends I'm a clinical instructor, but I don't spend any time or very little time doing clinical work and very little time instructing. It's really about building up your research program at that point. There is sort of this feeling, and the cartoon, if you can't see it, it's a guy basically saying I'm going to climb this DNA ladder and see where it takes me. So there is sort of this feeling of I'm heading in a direction, but I'm not sure exactly where. I'm not sure where this road is going to lead. So I spent 7 years working in Roy Zent's lab, and I think that was really important because, again, I did not have a PhD. So I look at that 7 years' time as sort of my graduate work and postdoc combined into sort of an accelerated type program, even though there was no degree that went with it. And one of the lessons I think that's really important to remember is that whatever you want to do and whatever questions you want to answer, you need to invest the time to get the skill set that will allow you to answer those questions. And this is a really important time to do that. The salary can be highly variable in that clinical instructor period. I would say you want to be very careful not to overload yourself, particularly the physicians in the audience with clinical work. That can raise your salary, but at the expense of your research program development. For me, I think the first 2 years as clinical instructor, I think my brother who was a waiter out in Breckenridge, Colorado, was making more per hour than I was during the first 2 years of that clinical instructor period. But then I got my Career Development Award, which I have to really put in a plug for the VA. It's really a great vehicle for both physicians and PhD investigators, but particularly for physicians, I think it can increase your salary quite a bit. So I think a lot of you probably have already had this experience. You have to be comfortable with the fact that a lot of your colleagues that you did training with have moved on, they've got nice houses, nice cars, and you sort of feel like you're stuck, and that you're like a glorified fellow. But again, I would say any success I've enjoyed, I think, is because I was patient during this time period. So again, don't be in a hurry, invest in your future. So I would look at this transition to your first sort of tenure track position as a time period when you can really gain the skills that you need to be successful. And I think if there's any one message I can say is don't be in a hurry and try to keep that time as protected as possible, because you can use it to explore, to make mistakes, to do a lot of things you don't have time to do later. And that, I think, was really important. And these chickens are just saying, you have to learn to be patient. Learn, I want to start now. There's this sort of urgency, I think, particularly when you're at the end of a long training period. But I would say the time, if you can slow down and really use that time to learn, it will pay off in great dividends later. Determine what you need to succeed and focus on those items. So figure out what, as you're trying to negotiate things like your startup package or what it is, I would focus on not what you want or what you think you deserve, but what you really need, and really try to focus the conversation on those items. Go for base hits and not home runs. So it's one thing if you're in a big lab, maybe as part of your postdoc, and you've got a lot of resources and a lot of people helping you, and you want to put out something in a high impact journal, more power to you. But when you're on your own and you have your few people that you're trying to manage and get things through, you just want to show that you can be productive, that you can get data out there and you can get published. So I would say early in your career, particularly as you're starting to separate away, really try to go for base hits initially. And then when you're in this position, you want to make sure that where you are, wherever your home institution is, it's a place that supports what you're doing, that its mission is consistent with sort of the work you're doing. And I think most of you are coming from great institutions in the Southeast, and that's probably not a problem. But you're going to be not in a good situation if you're in a place where they really value clinical revenue and don't put a whole lot of emphasis on research, and you're trying to come up with a research career. So it's something that I think I didn't think about, but you want to see what is the mission of your division and your institution, and how does what you're doing fit with that? I think it's really, really important to have early and often conversations with your mentor about what you can take as yours. And this may be a little bit more important for those in the basic science field than in clinical research. I was very, very lucky because for two reasons. One, Roy Zent was very generous about letting me sort of explore and do on my own. But also I carved out something that from day one, he was interested in, but not that much. He didn't have any funding on TGF-beta and renal fibrosis, and he really didn't have any plans to go into that direction. So it was very clear early on that whatever tools I developed, whatever I did, I could take that and run with it when I was on my own. And that really made for a very smooth transition in this period. So the other thing, some failure is important and inevitable. I thought initially about making this talk be just about my failures, because I could fill 45 minutes worth just of slides of things that didn't work. I think that particularly those who are coming from a medical training, failure is not something that you like, it's not something you're comfortable with, it's not something you want, but I think you can learn a lot from the mistakes you've made. And I'm just going to mention a few things. One of my first projects was to do a 5/6 nephrectomy on a mouse. I've never touched a mouse before. This didn't end well for the mice or for me for the first few months. I think the first 27 mice all died. Then the mice I was working with were on a C57 black 6 background. They evidently don't get glomerular sclerosis. So once I finally mastered this, I had no phenotype. But even though I now can do a 5/6 nephrectomy, I haven't published on it, but I learned so much about animal models of surgery. I got to be really good friends with my local vets and pathologists, and really those skills helped me later on. There was the case of cells with a mistaken identity, and I won't go too much into this, but I was making a lot of my own cell populations from these flox mice, and we took out the receptor at an early time point, and that produced some selection pressure where we actually selected for a cell population we didn't want. And it took a while for me to realize this. It was only when I re-expressed the receptor, but fortunately I realized this before the data went anywhere. And then there was the case of the FSP-CRE. So for those of you who have heard of this, it stood for fibroblast-specific protein, except that it wasn't specific for fibroblasts, but we didn't know that at the time. So I spent a lot of time using this model, which eventually I just had to throw away the mice. However, I think if you can learn from these experiences and see them as valuable lessons, then you can really grow from that. And then when you're on your own, I think you're less likely to make some of these mistakes. Continue to hone the skills that you need. So in medical school and residency, I always thought it was sort of interesting. You focus on your clinical skills, and in fellowship, you're focusing on your bench skills. But really, at some point, what determines your success is sort of your writing, your personnel management, and ability to lead a team. And so I think what you need to go in is with the mindset that you're always changing and developing new skills. And it's not like you've gotten your skills, you're there, and you just coast. You have to constantly reevaluate, what do I need to be successful? How can I get these skills? So thinking about, with the GPS, when you sometimes take a wrong turn, as I've been known to do, and then the little thing says recalibrating. And I think sometimes in your career, you sort of have to recalibrate too. And it may be a small recalibration, just thinking maybe the approach you took didn't work or it's not getting funded, and you need to sort of think about how you can approach things differently. For me, this came in the form where I had been focusing on TGF-beta, and I had a really great conversation with Ray Harris, who was my division chief at the time. And he said to me, do you want to be a TGF-beta person, or do you want to be a renal injury person? He said, because if you want to be a TGF-beta person, you need to go and get a postdoc somewhere else. You need to really understand this. And so it kind of made me change a little bit how I thought about the direction of my career. Some projects just aren't going to work for now. I looked at TGF-beta signaling in fibroblasts, and at the time there was a lot of sort of discussion, controversy. What are these cells? How do we define them? And my mentor committee finally said, you know what, publish what you've got and get out. This is not a field that you're going to be successful as a young investigator. And I may come back to that, but I think you have to be open to the comments of your mentor committee. So my evolution of my science, I deleted this receptor and found this unexpected finding, where to go next. And so what I really wanted to do is take what I found and really apply it more broadly to understand the progression of fibrosis. And so I thought maybe this TGF-beta approach, maybe it can tell me something that we don't know already about the progression of disease and injury responses. And if we can understand what are the beneficial things that TGF-beta may be doing, then maybe we can take this more broadly and it can provide a clue for new therapeutic approaches. So a little comment about big data and small labs. So initially, everything seems, in the news, big data, and I kind of didn't really like the big data movement because to me it's not as hypothesis generating, it's not as exciting to me, but I think you can use big data in a way to help you generate hypotheses. And so we've done some RNA-seq, and that helped identify some pathways that were altered when we took out the TGF-beta receptor, and it looked like cell cycle and some other growth factor pathways were really changed, and that's a direction then that I was able to move into. So kind of I looked more, kind of moved through this quickly, but now I'm doing a lot of work looking into the cell cycle and how does the epithelial cell cycle change in the context of injury. And so you want to develop some tools to help answer the question that you're interested in. So we can, and this may not show up great, but we're able to label with a reporter these proximal tubule cells, kind of fact sort them out and model the cell cycle in vivo, which was a powerful tool. There's this Fucci reporter mice. It's always good if you can have some sexy, exciting new tool that you can use to answer your questions. And then we also started to look into mitochondrial injury and found, hopefully you can see these mitochondria with the big white holes are certainly not normal. So I started with this sort of unexpected finding of worsening injury when we deleted the TGF-beta receptor. But that's allowed me to investigate more broadly things like cell cycle, mitochondrial function, and metabolism in the context of renal epithelial injury, and adopt some new tools. And again, getting those new tools, I think having time that was protected and also having had a secondary appointment in cell and developmental biology, which was sort of my interaction with the real scientists. And I think that allowed me to see some of these tools that they were using and then to apply them to my work. And this is just a picture with MitoTracker of some mitochondria that we're looking into. So I thought I would sort of end, for those of people who used to watch Letterman's late night show, he would always have top 10 lists, and I thought I would do this in the context of the top 10 cliches about science that really are true. So these are some things that you may have heard, but I'm going to spend a little time talking about them and say, and try to emphasize their importance and how I found they've been relevant to my career in science. The one caveat is that I couldn't squeeze them into 10, so it's actually the top 11. So find a good support system. I think this is really important. Surround yourself with people that you can trust and people you can go to. You need some optimistic and positive people in your environment. There are going to be times when you're feeling down, and you want some people you can go to who will say, you know what, take a step back, look at things, you're doing well, keep going. You want people you can celebrate your successes with together, even if those successes are small. It doesn't have to be a Nature Medicine first author paper. But it's important to sort of celebrate those successes as you go. I think it's important to find a support system at people who are at different career stages. So I'm very lucky at Vanderbilt. There were a lot of junior investigators who were sort of in the same cohort that I was in. I also think that people who are about 5 years ahead of you can be really, really valuable because they've gone through what you've been through and their memory of it is a little more crystal clear than people who are 20 years ahead. However, the people who are 20 years ahead are really valuable and you want to use their experience to help you out too. And again, I think sort of contacting these co-mentors who aren't your primary mentor, and they may not even be in your division. Sometimes it's better to get an outside voice to kind of let you know from their perspective how things are going and get advice. It's important to take calculated risks, and this was something that Roy Zent, my mentor, really hit me hard with. Obviously, if you take too many expensive risks, that can be very costly. But if you never take a risk, you won't move things ahead. So I think that's the thing, is thinking about where you want to take these risks. And what I mean by risks, so it may be that you need to invest in getting a new mouse or a new tool before you're completely clear about how helpful that tool will be. And sometimes you just have to, because time can be your enemy even more than money sometimes. So I think investing in these calculated risks is important. But don't put all your eggs in one basket. And I remember meeting an investigator who had an MD PhD, he'd worked with a really prominent scientist, and had first author papers in Nature, Cell, and Science. I mean, if you think anyone is going to succeed, this guy seems like he had the phenotype. Well, he took all of his startup funds and putting it into developing one mouse. And when that mouse didn't work, instead of moving on and trying to come up with something else, he spent more time trying to figure out why the mouse didn't work. And everything sort of sunk his startup funds, and he ended up switching off track. Science can open doors. Not so much this. So the cartoon on the left is basically the entomology department literally trying to bust through the doors. But more on the right, how your CV sort of can take you places. And I think this is one of the sort of exciting things I didn't expect about science, and the one experience I have, and I'm sure our judges in the front have their own experiences, and I challenge you to try to find out about them when we have more time one-on-one. But I was asked to be a judge in the National Siemens Math, Science, and Technology competition. So for those of you who remember the Westinghouse competition, it was basically, I guess, when Siemens acquired Westinghouse. It's the same competition, and it's a really fun thing. You go to DC and you have these high school kids who've come up with these great projects, and because one was related to an injury model I had worked with, I got invited to be a judge. So there can be a lot of unintended exciting things that happen with your career when you stay in science. Rejection is part of the job. Embrace it as a learning experience. And then in the cartoon it says, "Dear sir, I've just read your rejection letter, and I must say it is not up to the standard I have come to expect." So rejection is something that I think is particularly hard for the MDs in the audience, because you're not used to rejection, right? You got into medical school, you've been told you're at the top of your class, you've been very successful. For PhDs, I'm sure it's harder too, but I feel like sometimes that PhD colleagues have done better with that. It forces you to, but it can be a very good thing. It forces you to rethink things and innovate. I think most of my revised manuscripts have always ended up a much better product. It can be painful at times. Try not to take it personally, but realize you probably will take it personally, at least at first. And sometimes I just put them away for a little bit and then come back and revisit. One of my mentors recommended having a file in your email of positive things. So anytime someone sends you something, congratulations on this, or I think you did great at this, put it away in that positive folder, and then just revisit that folder when the rejections start to pile up. There are many ways to get to your destination. So, I will say, what works for your mentor probably won't work for you. You're not going to have anyone as hardworking as you working for you initially. So think creatively to get the resources you need. And I think whether you have a structured or less structured background, it doesn't really matter. It's sort of more about where you're going than where you've been. Keep your eyes on the prize and don't lose focus. So I was telling some people there's a book called Essentialism that's great about this. So eyes on the prize, not so much in the literal sense, but like the Bruce Lee quote, "The successful warrior is the average man with laser-like focus." Find out what it is you want to focus on, what that scientific question is, what you want to accomplish, and really pursue that. A lot of people will try to get you to do other things. Someone once said, if you don't define what's important, other people will. Don't forget to take vacations. So burnout, I think, is very real in medicine and science. And we were talking about this a little bit last night. There's a great New York Times article about how, at least for one person, academic medicine kept them from burning out. And that's because you do so many different things in academic medicine. And so I think there can be some real benefits. The flip side is you get asked to do a lot. And you have to set boundaries. You have to take time off. We all work very intensely at times, and I don't think that's the cause of burnout. I think it's more the failure to let yourself recover, renew, unplug, spend time doing the things that are restorative to you. So follow your passions. Money and prestige are nice, but they may not sort of sustain you. So by the 5th year, Jim really regretted following his childhood passion for ice cream. Some of the things that seemed like a great idea at the time, over the long haul, may not be sustainable. You may need to reevaluate this, but think about how you like spending your days and what is it that you really want to accomplish. Science is a marathon, not a sprint. So the tortoise is saying, you're going down. Take big tasks, whether it be your K award or your first RO1, and break them down into small, manageable chunks. Nothing is going to be accomplished, discovered in the course of a week. Give yourself time, plan for these things. They take way longer than you think they're going to take. And have a plan sort of for what's your 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, 3-year plan. Think about how these things are all going to plan out. As you might guess, I'm a planner. I'm a big list maker. I know some people are not that way, but I think it helps when you have these big tasks to be able to think about it in a systematic way. Persistence trumps intelligence. Yes, you do need to be intelligent, have a certain amount of intelligence, which I'm assuming you all have just by virtue of the fact that you're sitting here in this audience. But resilience is really important. Commitment to your goal. It's a war of attrition. Just keep plugging away. I think that's been one of my grants. I think I submitted 3 or 4 times before it got funded. But the important thing, no one remembers the 3 or 4 times. You might. They just remember it got funded. It's a long journey, so enjoy the ride. So it can be tough, but it can be extremely rewarding. And I think the important thing is not to focus on, once I get my K, life will be easy, or once I get my R, everything will be easy. It's a process, not a destination. Obviously you need to have those goals that you work for and try to achieve. But I think the important thing is really enjoying the journey because, that's the day-to-day stuff. And I think that's the end. So thank you very much for this opportunity.